Hi, this lecture is put together to help pull together the various theories about ethics that we've studied so far this term. I think this may help a great deal. I want to talk about a proposed normative basis and ask the question, what do you base your decisions on? Anytime you're confronted with a difficult decision, what do you base your decision on? Virtues, principles, consequences, or some combination of those? Probably some combination, but regardless of what you use, you must have some kind of criterion um, for selecting the appropriate virtue or principle. And your criterion is your normative basis for ethical decision making. All the reasons that are inside of you that lead you to choose one thing rather than another when you're deciding your behavior, when you're deciding what action to take in relationships, it comes from your normative basis. Now, normative basis gives you insight, as you can see here, into two things, being and doing. First, it's about who we should become as persons. Every action we take is informing who we are becoming as persons. Everything we do is moving toward a more complete sense of who we are as a person. And then it describes on how we should act in relation to others. That's the doing part. And I like to say in relation to people, to God, and to all of creation. So as you can see, it's our framework. It's those pieces you use to build a construct that tells you what to look for when you're going to make a decision. A lot of elements, but the essence doesn't change. It's kind of like a basketball game, I think. I never played sports much, but I've watched them some. In basketball, the game is played all over the world in all kinds of different places, even though it was invented close by at the University of Kansas by Naismith. But it's played everywhere. And different uniforms, different courts, different audiences, different settings. But there's one thing that always defines its essence, and that is the rule book. The same rule book guides basketball wherever it's played anywhere, and that is the essence. And our normative basis becomes our rule book or our essence that guides us into making those decisions, just as a basketball player has to make decisions as to where to throw the ball, how to shoot the ball, how to make contact with other players. It all is done in the context of the normative basis, or in their case, the rules of basketball. Well, we begin with the goal of human life. And we always use some normative basis, even if we don't know it. It's there, but we all lead ethical lives, you say. How can this be if we all have a normative basis? Or we don't all lead ethical lives. I didn't read that correctly. But you say we all don't lead, let me start that again. We don't all lead ethical lives. And how can this be if we have a normative basis? Well, I think there's several reasons for this. First, you'll acknowledge with me that we are imperfect people, and sometimes we simply lack the moral strength and courage to make good choices. You can search back and find experiences like that for yourself now. And for this group, as adults, it's easier to find those instances in life than it is with the college students that I teach sometimes. But what it amounts to is to say that moral discernment can be hard work. Well, sometimes we really don't know the right thing to do. And once again, moral discernment can be hard work trying to figure out just what it is to do. We draw a blank. We don't know. Sometimes we don't have the ability or the energy to follow what we do know. And finally, we can be short-sighted. We can suffer from moral myopia. And in that case, we never get around to moral discernment because we don't even acknowledge that there's a moral issue at stake. Every action we perform in life is directed toward a particular goal. So think to yourself, what are some examples of everyday actions and goals? What are some goals you have for today? What are some of the actions that you plan to move toward those goals? Because every action we take is always directed toward a goal. And we define our goals in terms of the payoff. What is it we expect to get out of this in life? It may be something very selfish, it may be something grand, it may be something very beneficent to others, but there's always a payoff. That defines for us what our goal is, why we're taking this action, helps us choose the action. We begin with the goal of human life, and I think I've talked about this some before in another context. What is your goal of life? Now, as adults now, this may seem a little frivolous, but is it to have fun? Is it to be successful? To be smart? To be compassionate? To love others? Do these or any others that you can think of give meaning to your life? That's what identifies our goals. We are trying to make meaning in life. That is one of the concepts of spirituality from a non-religious perspective. Spirituality is identifying and living into those things that make meaning in life. Well, our one fundamental overarching goal in life is human flourishing. And that comes from Aristotle. Aristotle said that's the one thing everybody lives toward in life, is to flourish. And that can mean different things to different people, but he had some very noble ideas about what that meant. All other goals in our life should point toward human flourishing. So if we're taking some actions that don't point in that direction, we have to ask ourselves, why are we making those choices? What's the payoff from those choices if it doesn't help us flourish as human beings? Human flourishing is based on living a good life, and as I say time and again, in relation to other people, to God, and to creation. It's this long view that prevents moral myopia. It's this long view of where we're headed in this life and how we want everything to serve that ultimate goal that keeps us focused, like putting on my glasses and being able to see more clearly. Our fundamental overarching goal in life is our pair of glasses. Now, it becomes problematic when we allow something else to be our ultimate goal. We may just give lip service to saying human flourishing is our goal, that we have some very noble things that we are working toward, but there are also other things that we tend to work toward that tend to be much less than what human flourishing is. I've got a case here I want to read you from a book. It goes like this. Says, imagine you are a mid-level executive in a large, fast-moving organization. It could be a church, couldn't it? You value your job and you know it would be difficult finding another like it with the same salary in your town. You value your job for other reasons as well, not least of which is you need the income to pay costly school loan payments for yourself or for your children, and a hefty monthly rent for an apartment you love or a home you're purchasing. One unpleasant aspect of your job is that your supervisor seems, well, less talented than everybody else on his staff. And she is prone to violent outbursts. Well, I should say he. Women don't have violent outbursts, I suppose, do they? He or she is prone to violent outbursts with some of the lower ranking employees. Recently, he publicly berated his administrative assistant for not completing a report on time, even though he had given her the data to complete it at the very last minute. It was obvious to everyone that he was attempting to blame someone else for his poor work habits and his poor planning. Now, you want to do something about his behavior. Perhaps you want to report him to one of his supervisors. However, due largely to his ability to bring in large accounts to the company, he has gained the favor of the company's president. Consequently, no one else is willing to stand up to him, and you will have to go it alone. You are unsure how your accusations will be handled. You fear that you will be seen as a problem and could even lose your job. So what would you do in this situation? Now remember, simply stated, ethics concerns any behavior or decision that affects human well-being, dignity, the character, the quality of life, and the good of the community. That's how we get these dilemmas. When we see everything that we believe contributes to our human flourishing, and then we see, but I got to keep this job even though I don't like it or I'm not pleased with who's there. When we see all the negatives, we have trouble. One more thing I'll read to you here. It says, the scope of ethics is large, and its basic task is to ask and seek answers to two related questions. Who ought we to become as persons, and how ought we to act in relation to others? In addressing these questions, we consider a number of things. The Greeks called this human flourishing. I'm going to get to those things in a moment, but the Greeks called this human flourishing eudaimonia, or happiness. And it means, simply translated, as something that makes you happy. It's to be sought for itself. It's not as a means to something else. You aren't doing A in order to get B. It's just you pursue happiness. Now, happiness is not something frivolous. It is a well-formed character that produces a life of virtue. That's where all this heads. Aristotle's saying if we live a life of virtue, then we will feel happy and our lives will flourish. The Christian understanding of human flourishing is pretty easy to see. We see love of God and neighbor and asking who is your neighbor so that we can identify how shall we love? What is it we're called to do to really be happy in this life? And love of God, of course, is expressed in all of our human relationships. The examples of crisis in human flourishing, though, can be seen in a couple of films. I hope you're familiar with them. The first is Castaway. Actually, that should be two words, Cast Away, with Tom Hanks. You may remember he gets stranded on a desert island, literally, where there is no one else. He's there several years. He considers taking his own life by hanging himself, but he fails. He finally finds this volleyball in a bunch of packages that came off of the ship with him, and he grabs the ball with his hand that is already bloody from trying to do some other things, and he looks at it and it seems to have made a face. And suddenly he recognizes he does have a companion. And the companion's name is even written right there. It's Wilson. And so this Wilson becomes his companion for the remainder of his duration on that island. We're not sure how long that is. But the point is, he had to be involved in another's life. He had to be contributing to another's life and know that someone else is participating in his life. Those are the right relationships that we seek. If you've seen I Am Legend with Will Smith, you may remember the world is virtually destroyed except for a bunch of monsters that kind of merge up out of somewhere, and he goes around trying to make things work in the world, even though he's all alone in what he's doing. He's looking for someone to have a relationship with. And so he keeps trying again and again to create relationship. These relationships are important to our flourishing. So it means simply that if we are to flourish, if we are to show our love of God through our loving neighbor, we need to be in right relationships. And what does that mean? It means relationships that are grounded in love, respect, dignity, and justice. And this is the essence of being a virtuous person. Now, virtues are character traits. They can be attitudes, they can be feelings, they can be dispositions, but they all define us as human beings of who we are, and they shape how we act toward others. So they define who we are, and they shape how we act in others. Some more examples of virtues are love and compassion, honesty, respect, dignity, justice. You see, these are the virtues that make up who we are as human beings. Now, if you are absent those virtues, then what kind of a human being are you becoming? You might say if you're a person who lies all the time, eventually you will be known by all as a liar. If you're someone who tells the truth all the time, you will be known by all eventually as a truth teller who can be relied upon, someone who has integrity, someone who is faithful to who he says he is. Doing the right thing. Well, is it predicated on being a good person? Must you be a good person in order to do the right thing? Or might you just be lucky once in a while and just stumble upon the right thing, even though you're kind of a lousy person? And it causes us to ask, does everybody you know have the capacity to be virtuous? We think of the heinous things that go on in our world and how people do harm to other people, and we wonder, is there any virtue in that person? Is there anything that can be captured and used to help that person be identified ultimately as a good person? And we might ask, if we know a good person, even ourselves, does a good person have the capacity ever to be less than virtuous? Well, depending, of course, on your theology of sin and recovery from sin, we are able to be less than virtuous, but we seek to be virtuous. It doesn't mean we're always successful. It means that is what we're striving to be. So Socrates, even before Christianity, would say we must always be looking inward, reflecting. He said the unexamined life is not worth living. It's through examining our lives and holding them up, holding them against the virtues that we say are important to us, that define us, that lets us know if we are being virtuous. So who do you believe to be virtuous in your life? Prima facie. And prima facie means before anybody can refute it, before it can be rebutted by other evidence you don't have yet, but at the beginning at least you say, here's a virtuous person. Why do you regard them to be virtuous? Do they ever fail in their virtue? Are you one of those persons you believe to be virtuous? And are there sufficient numbers of others who would agree with you that you feel like you're making a justified claim? Here's one source of virtue training that some of us have gone through. This is the Scout Law. A Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, and so on. These are all virtues that we try to teach young boys as they are becoming adults. If we feel like if they can grasp these virtues and let them define who they are in relation to others and in relation to God and creation, then they are going to be virtuous people. They are going to be happy people. They will flourish as human beings. Now, principles are important. Principles are what help define virtues. So a principle, we can define it simply, a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behavior or for a chain of reasoning. For example, the basic principles of Christianity. You'd have no trouble, would you, in sitting down to write down what those basic principles are? We might disagree on what they are in detail or how they might be articulated, but generally, you kind of know what the basic principles of Christianity are, and the rest of us do too, who regard ourselves as Christians. Now, why are principles important to virtuous living? Well, they do these things for us at the very least. Principles give rise to virtues. They pave the way for becoming virtuous. By making decisions in accord with certain principles, we are becoming more virtuous each time we do so. And it specifies what virtue demands of a person in real situations. Virtue doesn't just sit there passively. Every time we have to make a decision, especially in a difficult situation, we are confronted by those virtues that we have chosen to define who we are. So they become standards against which we can evaluate our choices. But don't let the principles become absolute inflexible rules. You remember when we were talking about Immanuel Kant and his categorical imperative. Some people say that the liability in being a deontologist like Kant is that principles become rules, and the principles or rules become more important than the persons. And so those folks who are consequentialists believe that we need to have greater regard for the outcome that we have. Well, that's a debate between deontology and teleology. And we're doing now what Levin calls ideology or virtue ethics. But we have these different theories because people have different beliefs about how we accomplish the good thing. But we could undermine virtue by turning it into rules. Virtue is something that should exist in us and function naturally as a part of who we are, rather than becoming a list of rules that we check off. Principles are meant to serve people, not the other way around. And so if we make the main thing serving the principles, then we've missed the point. And that's one of the errors that we can make in deontology. We can say that the rules are more important than the people because Kant said, if you remember, when you have a dilemma, you find the rule, you point at the rule, and you follow it. Even if you get an outcome you don't like, the most important thing is to follow the rule. But he justifies that by saying, if we always are to follow the rules, we know that in the long run, humankind is valued. People are valued, and the better things are going to happen. There may be some occasional immediate outcomes that we think are wrong, but ultimately the good will prevail. That's his theory about rules in deontology. But we are more concerned with the virtue of who we are and how that informs it. You see, Aristotle's theory about virtue is that, as I said earlier, if we are virtuous persons, then we will be flourishing and we will be the good persons that we strive to be. If the whole world were made up of virtuous persons who always followed their highest virtues, there would not be conflict, there would not be war, there would not be difficulty in caring for one another. Now, we could say that the two overarching principles, the ones that maybe are above everything else if we continue to use the Aristotelian model, are human dignity and justice. Think about those for a moment, how many things you could fit under that title of human dignity. And then justice. Literally, all of the decisions that we make as a people working together in community or in government, as a nation or as a household. If we're always striving to maintain human dignity for every individual we're with, and if we're always wanting to make sure that justice prevails, when we're figuring out who gets what in this world, as we're trying to distribute scarce resources and make sure that everyone is meted out what they need, what they want, maybe what they should have, whatever method we use. But we say justice means everybody is getting their due. It's a difficult goal, but maybe these are the two principal issues, or principles, I think. Now, out of human dignity, these other principles may flow. If we're always working on human dignity, then we'll be thinking about the sanctity of life and beneficence, doing good things, veracity, being truthful, and autonomy, realizing every individual gets to decide who they are and make their own choices, and all of the informed consent. I use that out of healthcare, but surely it has to do with all facets of life. People should not have something done to them without their consent. It's kind of a golden rule issue if you think about it. Privacy and confidentiality, care of the whole person, and so on. You can read through there. Proportionate and disproportionate means also comes out of healthcare, actually, from Catholic moral theology as it applies to healthcare. It means that proportionate things are those things which may accomplish something that is greater than the burden caused for the individual. If it's disproportionate, it means the burden of the treatment in healthcare is greater than the possible outcome. And then the principle of double effect is there as well. If you think of the principle of double effect in a healthcare basis, once again, I can turn again to the Catholic ethical and religious directives, which we'll be looking at next week. But it says, for example, abortion is prohibited unless there is a serious pathology with the expectant mother that can be treated, but we can't avoid causing the death of the fetus. Our intention is not to kill the fetus. Our intention is to heal the mother. But the double effect is there. The issue is what is intended. We'll talk more about that next week when we're looking specifically at healthcare ethics. That's human dignity. Then from justice, we have these principles that flow. The common good, relationality, that means how we live among ourselves. Solidarity, everybody knowing that we're there pulling for each other. Subsidiarity is a fancy word which means we always try to solve problems at the lowest possible level between the two people who are having the problem rather than getting everybody else pulled in. Stewardship is a virtue not just in how we give our money to the church, but in how we handle all of our resources. It's a great ecological concept. And the others that you see here, care for the marginalized, equitable distribution of scarce resources, and always the preferential option for the poor, which is very strong in Catholic moral theology. Well, these principles and more, you can think of more, but they are the ones that establish our normative basis. The big picture then, the big picture view of the virtuous life includes what we are trying to accomplish ultimately in life, who we should become as persons, and how we should act in relation to others. It's about being and it's about doing. And then principles are the backdrop to all of our moral decision making. And that's what we've been discussing. When we finish with this lecture later, you might do an exercise for yourself, trying to explain to yourself what principles are the backdrop to any moral decision you're having to make. Here's a model of kind of shows the relationship among all of these elements. Human flourishing leads to right relationships, and right relationships leads to human flourishings. That's why it's a double arrow in each position. But all the elements we've been talking about, how they interact. And this is the rhythm or the interplay that occurs within us morally when we're making decisions, making choices. You can see the elements there in that model. From human flourishing to acting virtuously. We begin, if we're flourishing, then we have right relations, we are becoming virtuous, and we act virtuously. And that is the goal. Another way to look at the normative basis, I'm not sure I'm wild about this model, but I made it, so we'll use it. These are all the dimensions of the human life. And all of these things come together to define who we are. And so there is virtue attached to all these dimensions of the human life. And these are what create, again, our normative basis. Everything about us that is. And so these are just the different elements. If you've talked sometimes about the different elements of the human being, these are the kinds of things that you would list. So here's how you use discernment to make a personal moral decision. Now, I've been dropping that word from time to time discernment, but discernment probably is a simple way of saying it's how we figure out the right thing to do. We try to discern what is right. We try to discern what somebody else's intention is. We try to look at things and figure out what is reality in this case. Here's how we do it. We can do it through personal reflection, which is opening ourselves to God's presence. We do it through self-knowledge, trying to understand who we are and what drives us and what causes us to do different things. It is done through contextual analysis. Now, seeing the morally relevant features, and that's an important phrase in ethics, seeing the morally relevant features in any situation. What's happening? Why is it happening? How is it happening? Who's doing it? When and where? What's likely to happen? And are there alternatives we can follow? Let's see everything that's going on. If we were to go back to H. Richard Niebuhr's 2 questions, where he says always you begin by asking what's going on, and then you say, what's the appropriate response? Well, the contextual analysis is the what's going on portion. Then critical evaluation. There's the external criteria for evaluation, measuring against scripture and church teaching, community, values, principles, and the internal criteria, what makes us feel harmonious within, and the integration of everything about us. The steps of discernment and decision-making go like this. You gather all relevant factual information. You identify the ethical issues. Consider what relationships require and what leads to human flourishing. In other words, you don't make these decisions in isolation. You make them with regard to how you are going to live in relationship to others. This is an especially appropriate consideration for how we make decisions in the church community. When we brainstorm possible options, we weigh the options and select one, and then we evaluate the decision against internal and external criteria. If you remember from the last slide. Rachels and Rachels are 2 people who related, brothers, who wrote a book, The Elements of Morality. And this is a quotation that I believe really is helpful today from their book. It says, if we want to discover the truth, we must let our feelings be guided as much as possible by reason. This is the essence of morality. Now think about that. Even the Christian ethicist, the Christian theologian, is going to say that everything that we find that is written, everything we know about Scripture and about God, we still use it in a process of reasoning to choose how we will act toward others. It's allowing us to claim that not every individual action or choice that we make is going to be articulated in Scripture. We can look at the 10 Commandments and we can look at the Beatitudes and we can see principles, but they're not about every possible expression of that principle. So we use reasoning. The process of reasoning is what we do. And the morally right thing to do is always the thing best supported by the arguments that we come up with. We can't rely on our feelings, no matter how powerful they may be, Rachel says. Our feelings may be irrational. They may be nothing but the products of prejudice and selfishness or cultural conditioning. Think, if you would, for a moment about all the arguments around immigration that are going on right now. We are relying a lot on our feelings as this is being argued. They say at one time, for example, people's feelings told them that members of other races were inferior, and that slavery was God's plan. And in fact, I'm sure you're aware that people could quote Scripture very articulately in defending those beliefs. So the requirement of impartiality is the bottom, nothing more than a rule against treating people arbitrarily. That's what Rachel and Rachel say about reason and impartiality. It's a rule against treating people arbitrarily. We think things through. We discover what the principles are that we apply to our decisions and how they are appropriate, rather than just making quick, arbitrary decisions from our gut, from our prejudices, and from our biases. One more quotation from Rachels and Rachels. They say, morality is then, at the very least, the effort to guide one's conduct by reason. That is, to do what there are the best reasons for doing, while giving equal weight to the interests of each individual affected by one's decisions. What are the best reasons we have, and what do they point to? That's the direction that we want to go in our moral decision making. The conscientious moral agent, then, we can say, is someone who is concerned impartially with the interests of everyone affected by what he or she does. We do not live in isolation. Every decision we make, every action we take affects many other people. Um, the conscientious moral agent is someone who carefully sifts facts and examines their implications, who accepts principles of conduct only after scrutinizing them to make sure they are justified. The one who tries to discern who is willing to listen to reason, even when it means revising prior convictions. And the moral agent is one who finally is willing to act on the results of this deliberation. I'd spend some more time with that statement because it really does talk about the character of the moral agent. And we are moral agents every time we make a decision about trying to choose the right thing to do. So my concluding statement is what I began with. Moral discernment is hard work. It takes time. You have to pause. You have to reflect. You have to gather information. You have to think. You have to reason. You have to make your arguments and then come to the best conclusion you think you can about what the right response is, the right action is. Ethics, after all, is simply figuring out the right thing to do.